They said no one would ever hear it again. A song so indecent, so raw, so dangerous to the moral fabric of America that the men in smoke-filled offices signed an order to bury it. The year was 1947. The war was over, the soldiers were home, and the radio was the pulse of the nation. But somewhere between jazz's rising horns and crooners' crooning of safe suburban love, a woman's voice cut through the static. Her name, Wilma Fingerdoo, the title of her song, They Do Me Doggy Style, and for 8 nights only, it slipped past the censors and poured into the ears of a country that was not ready to hear the truth. Every video here is more than just content. It's crafted with love, talent, and the drive to create something meaningful. Subscribe this channel only if you're ready to see what they swore you'd never know. They erased this from history. We're putting it back. Subscribe before it disappears again. Imagine the scene. A dim-lit nightclub in Chicago, the kind where the smoke never cleared and the men drank until their secrets leaked out of them. On stage, a woman with fire in her throat and defiance in her eyes dared to sing words the nation wasn't supposed to know. Words that mocked purity, mocked propriety, mocked the great American dream itself. And in that moment, she was more dangerous than any gangster, more subversive than any spy. For Wilma Fingerdoo sang about the one thing institutions could not control: desire. But here's the part they don't tell you in the history books. The song wasn't just banned, it was erased. Newspapers were ordered not to print her name. Radio stations were threatened with closure if they replayed the track. FBI files labeled her a social contaminant. And overnight, Wilma Fingerdoo disappeared. No grave, no farewell show, just silence. What could a song reveal that made men in power panic? Why did 3 minutes of music 10 the pillars of church, state, and family? Was it just about sex, or was it about something much deeper, something those in control couldn't afford for ordinary men to hear? This is not just the story of a forgotten hit. It is the story of how institutions silence voices, how desire is weaponized, and how every one of us has been trained, since birth, to fear the forbidden. And tonight, I will take you down the rabbit hole of the 1940s scandal no one dared to write down. Because once you hear the words, once you know why they buried her song, you can never return to who you were before. Before Wilma Fingerdoo sang a note, before her name became a whispered joke in backroom bars, she was simply a girl raised in a world that taught her to keep quiet. Born in 1919, in a Mississippi town where the church bells rang louder than any human voice, she grew up surrounded by rules that pressed down on her spirit like iron. Women were told to cook, to pray, to smile politely when men made the decisions. But Wilma's rebellion began not with her voice, but with her silence, because she watched and she remembered. She saw what no one was supposed to notice. Preachers who preached purity by day, but visited brothels by night. Politicians who praised family values while buying mistresses' silk dresses on payday. Husbands who demanded loyalty yet disappeared into the alleys of New Orleans. By the time she was 16, she had already understood a truth most men will never admit. Society is not built on morality, but on hypocrisy. And when she moved north to Chicago in 1939, she carried that truth with her like a blade. The city was alive with jazz and sin, a carnival of lights and liquor, a stage for anyone daring enough to defy the rules. Wilma found her stage in the smoky basements, where the piano keys were heavy with sweat, and the audience leaned in close, waiting for someone to speak the words they were afraid to say. At first, she sang standards, safe songs about love, longing, and heartbreak. But she saw the hunger in the crowd. Not hunger for food or for drink, but for honesty. For a voice that would cut through the lies and name the shadows for what they were. And then, one night in 1946, she wrote the song that would destroy her. They Do Me Doggy Style. A title half laugh, half dagger. The lyrics weren't crude for the sake of shock. They were satire. They were exposure. Every verse revealed a darker layer of American life, cloaked in innuendo so sharp it left wounds. This wasn't just about sex. It was about power. About the way men use desire to dominate, and the way women are told to endure it in silence. Wilma turned silence into melody and shame into rebellion, but in doing so, she crossed a line drawn not by God, not by morality, but by institutions terrified that truth might spread through music faster than sermons could contain it. And so, her fate was sealed. The night it happened, it wasn't supposed to happen at all. A late-hour disc jockey at a Chicago station, half drunk, half bored, slipped a record onto the turntable, thinking it was another harmless jazz number. But when the needle dropped, and Wilma's voice slid out of the speakers, something electric spread across the airwaves. It wasn't just the rhythm, it was the way she laughed in the pauses, the way her words danced just on the edge of vulgarity, daring anyone listening to admit they understood. Men pulled their cars over on deserted roads just to hear the song in full. Housewives in quiet kitchens froze with their hands on the dishwater, heartbeats racing at words they had been told were unspeakable. By the time the track ended, the station's phone lines were burning. Some called in furious, demanding the DJ be fired, screaming that the filth would poison the nation's youth. But others begged to hear it again. They whispered into the receiver like addicts, asking when she would sing next, where they could find her, whether the rumors were true. And for a brief, trembling week, the forbidden bled through the static of America's radios, like cracks in a dam no one could patch fast enough. In backrooms, copies of the record were passed hand to hand, sold for cash under tables, hidden under coats like contraband liquor during Prohibition. Soldiers, young men fresh from the battlefields of Europe, said they preferred Wilma's song to any medal they had carried home. "She tells the truth," they muttered, voices thick with something between awe and shame. But that was the danger, wasn't it? Not that the song existed, but that men were listening, that women were listening, that laughter at the old rules had begun to spread. Because if people could laugh at purity, if they could mock the chains they'd been told were holy, then control itself would start to collar. See, the churches knew it. The government knew it. The record executives who lived fat off sanitized love ballads knew it. Wilma's voice wasn't just corrupting morality, it was corrupting obedience. And so, the order was given. Erase her. Erase the song. Make the public forget before the fire spreads. The machine moved faster than Wilma could have imagined. Within 48 hours of that midnight broadcast, memos circulated across Washington, stamped urgent, moral decay. Radio executives were summoned into smoke-choked rooms where government men in grey suits laid down the law. This record never existed, this woman never sang, and anyone caught distributing her filth would be dealt with. The language was clinical, but the eyes behind the words burned with something deeper: fear. Not fear of Wilma herself, but of what her song represented. The collapse of the illusion that the American household was pure, orderly, obedient. The FBI took charge quietly, as they always did when culture threatened control. Agents raided small radio stations, seized crates of shellac records, and questioned disc jockeys under the pretense of national security. Those who resisted lost their licenses, their studios shuttered overnight. Newspapers, once eager for scandal, suddenly went silent. A few had tried to print her name alongside headlines about obscenity in the airwaves, but the presses were stopped, entire editions pulped before reaching the street. By morning, it was as though the story had been cut out of the nation's memory with a surgeon's knife. Meanwhile, in the polished offices of the record industry, men who once praised Wilma's talent now treated her like a disease. Contracts were shredded, her name scrubbed from catalogs. Warehouse workers were ordered to destroy every copy of her recordings. And yet, Whispers spread that some employees, unable to bear the act, hid copies in basements, in walls, even buried them in tin boxes beneath their porches. Perhaps they knew they were holding not just a song, but a piece of dangerous history. For Wilma herself, the world narrowed to locked doors and strange men tailing her footsteps. She wasn't arrested. No, that would have drawn too much attention. Instead, she was slowly erased, stripped of venues, silenced on the air, blacklisted until her phone stopped ringing and her voice fell to nothing more than a rumor. And when people asked where she had gone, the answer was always the same, delivered with a tight smile. Wilma Fingerdoo never existed. But songs have a way of living longer than their singers. And even as the official story was written, copies of that record, the forbidden record, still spun in the shadows, waiting for someone reckless enough to press play. But Wilma wasn't done. Not yet. When the lights of the big stages went dark, when her name was scraped from marquees and her voice vanished from the radio, she slipped underground. Chicago had its back rooms, its whiskey-soaked basements, its hidden bars where the law only mattered if someone chose to enforce it. And it was here, in these smoke-thick caverns beneath the city, that Wilma's true audience began to gather. Soldiers, factory girls, drifters, even the occasional politician who wanted to taste corruption without leaving fingerprints. Each night they came, packed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for her voice to pierce the silence. Wilma never sang the song the same way twice. Sometimes she leaned into the filth, dragging out the syllables until the room groaned with nervous laughter. Other times she dropped the words into sly metaphors, coded and clever, so that only the sharpest ears caught the meaning. But always, always, she ended with that laugh, that devil's laugh that told every listener, the rules they gave you are already broken, and you are free to laugh at them. The underground performances became legend. No posters announced them, no advertisements dared. But whispers traveled faster than any headline. She'll be there Friday. Bring cash. No names. By the time the first note hit, the door was barred shut, and for 1 hour the world outside ceased to exist. Those who saw her swore it was more than music. It was ritual, a tearing away of masks, a glimpse at something America wasn't supposed to admit lived inside it. And the more the authorities tried to choke her voice, the more powerful it became. In some neighborhoods, women began humming her tune while hanging laundry. Dock workers tapped the rhythm on rusted pipes. Even school children dared to whisper fragments of the lyrics, not even knowing what they meant, only that adults wanted them silent. It is no longer just a song. It was a signal, a secret code pulsing through the veins of the city, telling those who were tired of pretending, you're not alone. You've heard it too. And in that, Wilma had done something far more dangerous than scandalize America. She had created community, a cult without robes, a congregation without pews, held together not by doctrine, but by defiance. The underground couldn't stay hidden forever. Every city has ears, and Chicago's streets were thick with them. By the spring of 1947, the whispers had traveled farther than the government could allow. Anonymous reports began stacking up on the desks of men in dark suits. Crowds gathering. Obscene songs spreading. Dangerous laughter where there should be order. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Wilma's little cult of defiance was no longer a nuisance. It was becoming a threat. The crackdown came quietly, like it always does. Federal agents slipped into the bars dressed as ordinary men, their hats pulled low, their pockets lined with notepads. They took down names, traced addresses, marked every regular who dared show their face at Wilma's late-night sermons of song. At first, nothing happened. Then, one by one, those names started to vanish. A dock worker stopped showing up to his shift. A waitress left her apron hanging in the back room and never returned. A young soldier, barely home from war, was last seen leaving the club where Wilma sang, and by morning his bed was cold. No charges, no trials, just erasure. Official records listed them as runaways, deserters, suicides. But everyone who had sat in those basements knew better. They had seen the men in the grey coats. They had felt the shift in the air when the doors creaked open mid-song and silence fell, not out of respect, but out of fear. And Wilma? She sang through it. She never stopped, even when her eyes flickered to the shadows in the back of the room, even when she knew exactly what those men were writing in their notebooks. Her audiences grew quieter, tighter, more desperate. Every night felt like it could be the last. Some swore Wilma had begun weaving warnings into her lyrics, coded messages telling her followers to be cautious, to scatter, to trust no one. But still, they came. They couldn't resist. Because once you had heard that laugh, that blasphemous, liberating laugh, you couldn't go back to silence. And the more the disappearances mounted, the more powerful the myth became. To hear Wilma Fingerdoo was no longer entertainment. It was initiation, a choice. You weren't just listening to a song, you were declaring war on the lie that America demanded you live. And that kind of defiance, governments cannot forgive. By the summer of 47, Wilma Fingerdoo was no longer just a singer. She was a fugitive. Every alley, every passing car, every flicker of headlights on the wall felt like a warning. The city that once fed her fame now seemed wired against her, every face a potential informant. She learned to travel light, to leave apartments in the dead of night, to burn her own letters before they could be intercepted. The government didn't need to drag her to court. They only needed to make her life unlivable. And yet, for all the pressure, she refused to vanish. Because by now, the song had escaped her. Crates of records that should have been destroyed were smuggled out of warehouses, pressed into the hands of sailors and salesmen, carried across state lines like relics. In Detroit, jukebox operators whispered about a disc that made factory workers roar with laughter. In Kansas, a traveling preacher condemned the filth infecting the radios, though no one had officially aired it in months. Even in Los Angeles, where Hollywood guarded its image like a crown jewel, bootleggers pressed Wilma's voice onto fresh shellac, disguising it under false labels. Wherever the record landed, it spread like a sickness and like a cure. The authorities grew frantic. They called her degenerate, un-American, even a communist weapon meant to erode moral discipline. They weren't wrong, not in the way they feared, because Wilma's song was a weapon, not of ideology, but of disobedience. It taught people to laugh at power, to laugh at purity, to laugh at the cage they'd been born into. And once laughter takes hold, no decree can silence it. Wilma herself drifted from city to city, singing where she could, always one step ahead of the men who shadowed her. Her audiences shrank in size but swelled in devotion. To hear her live in those days was to witness defiance embodied, a woman who knew the cost of all, penning her mouth, and still chose to sing. Some said she performed with a pistol tucked into her dress. Others swore she carried nothing at all, that her weapon was only her laugh. By then, Wilma was no longer just hunted. She was hunted and multiplying. Every record, every whisper, every basement performance cloned her voice 1,000 times over. And no matter how far she ran, the song always seemed to arrive first, waiting for her like a shadow. The breaking point came on a rain-slick night in St. Louis. By then, Wilma's face was etched onto every watch list, though never shown to the public. Officially, she didn't exist. Unofficially, she was the most dangerous woman in America. That night, word spread through the underground like wildfire. Wilma would perform one last time in a basement hall beneath a shuttered hotel. No posters, no tickets, just whispers. And still they came. Dock workers with grease under their nails, housewives with hair pinned tight beneath raincoats, even men in fine suits who slipped off their wedding rings before stepping inside. The room was packed to suffocation, heavy with smoke, sweat, and fear. Everyone knew the risk. Some said the feds had already surrounded the block. Others swore the mayor himself had promised to crush this gathering. But when Wilma stepped onto that makeshift stage, hair wild, dress clinging from the storm outside, silence fell like a curtain. She didn't sing right away. She just looked at them, each face lit by the flicker of candlelight, and then she laughed. That laugh, low, knowing, defiant, rolled through the room like thunder. And when she finally launched into the song, it wasn't the coy, playful version that had first scandalized the airwaves. It was raw, sharp, dangerous. Each line felt like a blade pressed against the throat of America itself. She sang as though she knew it would be the last time, as though the walls were already closing in. Outside, engines idled. Boots splashed in puddles. The agents were coming, slow and steady, like vultures circling. Some in the audience began to panic, but Wilma only sang louder. She bent her voice into a weapon, tearing the air with laughter and venom, until even the children in the back understood. This wasn't a performance. It was a battle cry. And then, just as the song reached its final mocking crescendo, the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, screams, shouts, the crash of overturned chairs. By the time candles were relit and the agents stormed inside, Wilma was gone. No one saw her leave. No one ever would. That night became legend. Some swore she slipped into the tunnels beneath the city. Others believed she was taken, silenced once and for all. But for those who heard her final laugh echo in the dark, the truth was simpler. Wilma Fingerdoo had become untouchable. She was no longer a woman. They had made her into a myth. Disappearance didn't kill her. It made her immortal. In the weeks after St. Louis, rumors multiplied faster than the government could stamp them out. Some swore Wilma had boarded a train west, vanishing into the neon underbelly of Los Angeles. Others claimed she was hiding in New Orleans, singing in smoke-filled jazz dens where even the lawmen were too drunk to notice. But the truth hardly mattered. What mattered was that her absence gave birth to 1,000 versions of her, each one larger, darker, more dangerous than the last. Her record, once nearly destroyed, resurfaced everywhere. In alleyway markets, a man with a suitcase would open the lid to reveal a stack of forbidden discs, each sold with a warning: play it low, play it late, and never let the neighbors hear. Soldiers smuggled copies overseas, spinning them in barracks from Berlin to Tokyo. And in America's own cities, coded graffiti began to appear on brick walls and subway tunnels. A woman's silhouette, laughing, or just 3 letters: WFD. Those who knew, knew. Those who didn't walked past in ignorance. By 1948, Wilma's laugh had become a ghost haunting the nation. Housewives hummed her tune while hanging laundry, their children none the wiser. Teenagers whispered the lyrics in schoolyards, daring each other to repeat the forbidden words. Dock workers and drifters kept the song alive in rhythm tapped against bottles, boots, and steel. It was no longer just entertainment. It was initiation. To know the song was to belong to a hidden brotherhood, a family of outlaws bound by laughter instead of law. The government's silence only fed the fire. The less they spoke her name, the more power it carried in whispers. Each attempt to erase her only confirmed her legend. If she wasn't dangerous, why would they try so hard to bury her? And so Wilma Fingerdoo, the singer who never should have existed, became something greater than any radio star or stage queen. She became a curse, a rallying cry, a living reminder that control can be mocked, that chains can be laughed at until they rattle loose. And while officials assured the public that America was clean, pure, and obedient, in the shadows the people already knew the truth. Wilma's laugh still echoed, and it would not die. By 1949, Wilma's myth was no longer confined to whispers in basements or graffiti on alley walls. It had climbed higher, into the smoke-filled rooms where power itself was bartered. Politicians, preachers, and the quiet men who funded both began to whisper her name behind locked doors. Not in public, never in public, but in secret. They admitted what they feared. The song had slipped beyond their control. For every record they burned, 3 more surfaced. For every whisper they silenced, 10 more voices laughed in defiance. It became a forbidden currency. Judges, senators, and studio executives, the very men who called her obscene, paid fortunes on the black market for a single disc. Some wanted to hear it for themselves, to taste the scandal they condemned from the pulpit. Others wanted to destroy it, smashing the shellac to powder the moment it touched their hands, believing that if they killed the song, they could kill the spirit behind it. But for all their efforts, the record only multiplied, slipping into the hands of bellhops, soldiers, and traveling salesmen who carried it further than the men in suits could ever reach. The church took its turn as well. From pulpits across the country, sermons thundered against the devil's laugh and the woman who mocked decency. Fire and brimstone preachers claimed her song would bring judgment on the nation, that every child who hummed her tune was being lured to damnation. And yet, after services, parishioners whispered about knowing someone who had heard it, about a cousin who had a copy tucked beneath the floorboards, about the strange thrill of listening in the dark. And in the midst of it all, agents were still hunting Wilma herself. Some files claim she was spotted in Kansas City. Others insist she fled to Mexico, vanishing into border towns where American law couldn't reach. But the truth was slipperier than the papers. It trails. Wherever she had gone, her laugh got there first, echoing through jukeboxes, hidden recordings, and the hearts of those who dared to play her song when the world was quiet. The men in power had tried to bury her, but in their desperation, they revealed the truth. Wilma Fingerdoo was more than a singer. She was a contagion, and the harder they tried to kill her, the more unstoppable she became. By the early 1950s, Wilma's song carried a new reputation, no longer just forbidden, but cursed. The whispers spread like wildfire. A young man in Detroit played the record 3 times in a row, laughing until he collapsed, only to be found dead in his chair the next morning. In New Orleans, a preacher's daughter was caught humming the tune beneath her breath. Within a week, she vanished, her room left perfectly in order, except for the phonograph needle still spinning. Stories like these multiplied until the record itself became a kind of dare, a ritual whispered about in hushed tones. Play it alone, in the dark, if you're brave enough, but don't play it twice. Superstition fed the myth. Some swore the laugh on the recording changed, depending on who listened, sometimes playful, sometimes mocking, sometimes sharp as broken glass. Others claimed hidden messages surfaced if you spun the record backward, words not sung but hissed, warnings, curses, names. A few insisted the record wasn't just music at all, but a vessel, that Wilma had poured herself into the grooves, ensuring she would never be erased, never silenced, even if her body was gone. And the authorities, they didn't discourage these rumors. They let the fear do the work of suppression. If people thought the record could kill them, they wouldn't dare press play. But fear has a way of fueling obsession, and soon the most reckless, the most desperate, the most broken souls sought out Wilma's voice, not in spite of the danger, but because of it. To listen became an initiation into darkness, a mark of rebellion against both God and government. Collectors began to emerge, men who owned multiple copies, who gathered in secret to play them in candlelit rooms, watching each other for signs that the curse was real. Some left those gatherings pale and shaken, others never left at all, and through it all, no one knew the truth. Had Wilma been silenced? Or had she found a way to keep singing through the record itself? Because every time the needle dropped, and her laugh spilled into the shadows, it didn't sound like the past. It sounded alive. By the mid-1950s, Wilma's record was no longer just a relic. It was treasure, blood-soaked and coveted. The black market treated it like contraband gold. In hotel rooms and abandoned warehouses, men in tailored suits and drifters with nothing left to lose bid fortunes over a single disc. Stories circulated of secret auctions where the price of one copy could rival the cost of a house. The buyers were never ordinary fans. They were collectors of the forbidden, men addicted to power through possession, each one convinced that to own Wilma's laugh was to hold dominion over a secret the world was never meant to hear. But ownership was dangerous. Records went missing as often as they were found. Collectors were robbed, their homes ransacked, their vaults cracked open. Some were found dead beside their shattered phonographs, the needles still spinning in silence. Others simply vanished, their collections swallowed whole by fire, water, or the kind of theft no police report dared to acknowledge. The record was not just music anymore. It had become an object of violence, a relic that seemed to demand blood from whoever sought it. Rumors spread of entire collections hidden away in basements, passed down through families like cursed heirlooms. Children were warned never to touch the strange unlabeled discs locked in the attic. And yet, temptation always won. Teenagers would sneak a play when their parents were gone, only to swear afterward that they heard more than music, that Wilma herself was whispering to them, laughing at them, mocking them for daring to resurrect her ghost. The authorities, too, played their part in the hunt. FBI files, what little survived their redactions, hinted at agents tasked not with destroying the records, but with acquiring them. Some claimed that copies were locked in government vaults, labeled under cultural containment. If true, it meant the Sami, men who condemned Wilma's voice in public, still gathered in the dark to hear it in private. By then, the record was more than a song. It was a mirror, reflecting every hunger, every weakness, every forbidden desire America tried to hide. And those who sought it out knew the risk. Because the truth whispered through the underground was this: nobody owned Wilma Fingerdoo. She owned you. By the late 1950s, the forbidden song crossed an invisible boundary, from scandal into ritual. What began as a smirk-inducing novelty became scripture for those who prowled the edges of society. Secret societies in New York, Chicago, and even Washington, D.C. began whispering about the Wilma frequency, a tone buried in the laughter that could alter a man's state of mind. To outsiders, it was nonsense, but to the initiated, the record was no mere disc. It was an artifact, an instrument of control. There were whispered reports of gatherings in abandoned theaters, where men in masks sat in a circle while the record spun endlessly on a portable gramophone. The laugh, repeating like an incantation, was said to induce trances. Some claimed to see visions, faces in the smoke, doorways in the darkness, even words forming on the wall that were never painted there. The laugh became not just sound, but a key, unlocking parts of the mind long held shut. These were not harmless experiments. Newspapers from the era, clipped, buried, forgotten, hinted at mysterious deaths. University students who had reportedly experimented with the song were found wandering highways in the middle of the night, clothes shredded, eyes wide, unable to speak. Others vanished entirely, last seen carrying a portable phonograph and a look of obsession that terrified their friends. And always, the record was missing from the scene. Someone always took it. Someone always made sure it moved further underground, further into the hands of those who wanted it most. The forbidden does not simply disappear. It migrates. It finds the hungriest mouths. The government's silence during this period is louder than any denial. No official statement, no public warning, nothing but void. And yet, military psychologists were known to be researching audio manipulation at the same time. Coincidence? Or did they know what the public was never told? That Wilma Fingerdoo's song was not only dangerous because of its scandalous lyrics, but because it exposed the raw nerve of human suggestion, the machinery of the mind itself. What is clear is this: by 1960, the record was no longer just an underground curiosity. It had become initiation material. To hear it was to be changed. To repeat it was to bind yourself. To laugh with Wilma was to be marked. By the dawn of the 1960s, the influence of Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden record had slipped beyond smoky backrooms and midnight rituals. It began bleeding into the bloodstream of mass culture itself. The laugh, once too obscene for public broadcast, now echoed faintly in places no one expected. Commercials, jingles, and even certain government-produced films. Not the song itself, of course, but fragments. A cadence, a rhythm, a subtle mimicry. It was as though someone, somewhere, was seeding her ghost into the culture, planting her laughter in plain sight. Pop musicians, too, began to reflect her shadow. Studio producers whispered of accidents, where unexplainable distortion appeared on tapes. Distortion that, when slowed down, resembled the exact tonal curve of Wilma's forbidden track. One producer swore that a backup singer fainted during a late-night recording session after insisting she heard a woman laughing through her headphones. The tape was destroyed the next morning, or so they claimed. And then came the politics. Imagine a speech broadcast over black and white television, the nation hanging on every word of a candidate promising strength, safety, and freedom. Beneath the applause, some claimed they heard it. An echo, an almost inaudible chuckle stitched into the crowd noise. Analysts dismissed it as audio artifacts, but those who had heard the record before knew better. They recognized Wilma's ghost smuggled into the very fabric of trust. This was not coincidence. This was psychological warfare, hidden control through sound. Not bombs, not bullets, but frequencies. If laughter could shame a nation into silence once, why not harness it again? Why not use it to steer millions? By mid-decade, whispers grew louder that entire government programs were devoted to this. Military contracts for sonic influence research ballooned, their budgets sealed behind layers of classification. The same institutions that once banned Wilma's voice now dissected it, fed it into machines, tested its effects on soldiers, prisoners, and unsuspecting civilians. The laugh was no longer scandal, it was science. Yet the real danger wasn't the laboratories, it was the culture. Because while the government experimented behind locked doors, fragments of Wilma's influence bled freely into the mainstream. Songs climbed charts with rhythms suspiciously close to hers. Advertisements used repetition eerily like her verses, and audiences, millions strong, laughed when they were told to laugh, danced when they were told to dance, never suspecting that the seed of control had already been planted 2 decades before. By the late 1960s, Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden record had taken on a dual life, one public, one hidden. To the mainstream, her influence trickled invisibly, woven into jingles, speeches, and cultural rhythms no one thought to question. But in the shadows, away from television cameras and suburban comfort, there grew small, devoted circles who treated the record not as scandal, not as music, but as scripture. In abandoned warehouses, candlelit basements, and out-of-the-way desert shacks, these groups gathered around battered record players. They called themselves keepers of the laugh. Their ceremonies were hushed, ritualistic, and often dangerous. A single needle drop on the forbidden vinyl was treated like communion. They would sit in silence, waiting for the laugh to wash over them, some trembling, some weeping, others convulsing as though struck by revelation. For them, Wilma was no longer a woman. She was a prophet of frequencies, a messenger that the body could be enslaved through rhythm, the mind broken through sound. Stories leaked of groups pushing further, experimenting with amplifying her voice, layering it, reversing it, chanting along with it until voices cracked and minds snapped. Neighbors sometimes reported strange noises at night, laughter that wasn't laughter, like a chorus of wolves howling inside walls. And always when police came to investigate, the gatherings were gone, only the faint smell of wax, smoke, and vinyl left behind. Some of these circles even began writing their own gospels, scrawled in notebooks that mixed lyrics with warnings, diagrams of sound waves with symbols borrowed from ancient occult texts. They believed Wilma had unlocked a frequency older than civilization itself, one that priests, pharaohs, and kings once used to command obedience without raising a sword. To them, her laugh wasn't entertainment, it was a key, a weapon. Proof that the world could be ruled invisibly if one controlled the right vibration. Meanwhile, mainstream society danced, laughed, and consumed, oblivious to the parallel world being built beneath them. What they thought of as harmless jingles or catchy hooks were, to the cults, echoes of a sacred code. Every commercial break was scripture smuggled into the living room. Every hit single was ritual dressed in glitter. And as the 1970s crept closer, these two worlds, one hidden, one in plain sight, began to bleed together. More than one rising star in music was rumored to have attended a midnight listening session. More than one politician's aide was whispered to have slipped away into a back room with a scratched vinyl under their arm. The cults didn't need to grow into armies. They didn't need to march in the streets. All they needed was for the mainstream to hum along, unknowingly repeating the laugh, the rhythm, the code. By the early 1970s, the laugh was no longer confined to dusty vinyl or hidden cult gatherings. It had seeped, invisibly, into the bloodstream of public life. At first, it was subtle. Commercial jingles that made audiences laugh at things that weren't funny. Rally chants that stirred crowds into frenzy with only 2 or 3 repeated syllables. Theme songs that stayed lodged in the skull long after the television was switched off. But soon, there were events too strange to ignore. During a televised mayoral rally in 1972, an unremarkable slogan, 3 words, meaningless on their own, was shouted by a crowd of thousands with such rhythm and force that journalists on the scene swore it sounded less like democracy and more like ritual. The chant rose, swelled, then broke into spontaneous laughter, perfectly synchronized, as if the crowd had been cued by a hidden signal. No one questioned it at the time, but those who studied the footage later, carefully, frame by frame, claimed they could hear it faintly in the background, a laugh woven into the sound system, too low to consciously notice, but powerful enough to bind thousands of voices into one. Similar reports followed. A sports arena where the halftime show triggered a wave of hysterical laughter, lasting minutes longer than the act itself. A presidential address where the audience chuckled at words that were not jokes. Even a church revival where the congregation erupted in uncontrollable mirth. Some collapsing in aisles, others swearing they felt a presence pass through them like static electricity. And in every case, those who listened closely swore they heard the same thing. The rhythm, the laugh, the echo of Wilma Fingerdoo. The cults knew what was happening. To them, this was prophecy fulfilled. They boasted in coded newsletters that the Wilma frequency was being tested on a mass scale, that the secret had movebars, it from basement circles to entire cities. Some whispered that governments weren't fighting the record anymore, they were using it, that those once tasked with suppressing it had realized its true value, not as a song, but as a tool to steer whole populations. The laughter was no longer just scandalous, it was strategic. Every unison chuckle, every synchronized chant, every crowd that moved as one was proof that the forbidden had become weaponized. And beneath it all, one question grew louder than the laughter itself. Who, exactly, was conducting the unseen orchestra? By 1973, whispers of military experiments began to surface, rumors so unbelievable that most dismissed them as conspiracy. But the documents, when they leaked years later, told a darker story. In hidden bases and soundproof bunkers, the US military had begun testing what they called controlled laughter induction. The seed of it? A warped, barely recognizable recording of Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song. Soldiers were lined up in dim training halls, told they were participating in stress resilience trials. The record was played not in full, but in fragments. Distorted loops of laughter, rhythmic stutters that seemed harmless at first. But soon, reports described entire platoons convulsing in uncontrollable hysterics, tears streaming, unable to stop themselves. In some sessions, men fell to the ground laughing, clutching their sides until they vomited, until their bodies shook with exhaustion. And afterward, when the sound was cut, many claimed they felt euphoric, untouchable, even fearless, as though the terror of death itself had been rewired inside them. Field tests followed. Soldiers deployed into simulated battle zones were exposed to low-level frequencies of the laugh hidden beneath radio chatter. Observers reported eerie results. Men advancing without hesitation, charging into fire as if nothing could harm them, their mouths curled into grins that were not their own. They fought with reckless abandon, some even laughing as they fired their weapons, their humanity buried beneath the rhythm. The experiments did not remain secret forever. Fragments of testimony leaked from veterans who swore they'd heard something in the war zone, a background pulse no one else seemed to notice. A few spoke of hearing Wilma's laugh in their dreams, years after discharge, waking to phantom echoes in the dark. And some, too many to ignore, ended their own lives, leaving behind cryptic notes filled with laughter scrawled across the page. To the military, the experiments were a success. To the men, they were possession. The line between soldier and puppet blurred, and the true cost was hidden behind medals and silence. Meanwhile, the cults outside the military grew bolder. They claimed the generals had stolen what was theirs, that Wilma's song had always belonged to the chosen few. For them, the military's interference was proof that the record wasn't just dangerous. It was divine. By the mid-1970s, the laugh had spilled from the underground into war zones, political rallies, and living rooms alike. And what began as a scandalous novelty record had become something far more sinister. A weapon that erased choice, a frequency that bent will itself. By the late 1970s, it became clear that the influence of Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden record no longer required direct exposure. Her laugh, once confined to scratched vinyl and cult gatherings, had seeped into the airwaves, infiltrated media, and imprinted itself on the collective subconscious. Even those who never touched a record, never attended a midnight ritual, were not immune. Music, television, radio, all carried fragments, faint frequencies woven into the fabric of everyday life. A subtle stutter in a commercial jingle, an odd cadence in a pop hit, a background laughter in a broadcast. Each acted like a whisper, a suggestion, a gentle nudge into obedience, mirth, or obsession. Families began reporting strange phenomena at home. Children laughed without reason, staring at walls as if seeing shadows no one else could perceive. Adults found themselves compelled to mimic sounds, repeat phrases, or move in time to rhythms they couldn't consciously hear. Diaries from the period, later discovered in archives, describe households where laughter became involuntary, almost contagious, sometimes lasting hours. It was as though the record's essence had become a virus, invisible, airborne, seeding behavior with surgical precision. In universities and research labs, psychologists puzzled over the sudden rise of synchronized behaviors among groups exposed to media containing these hidden frequencies. Experiments in social psychology showed that subjects unknowingly exposed to these echoes were more compliant, more suggestible, and, strangely, more euphoric, even when the stimulus was unpleasant. The mechanisms were still poorly understood, but the effect was undeniable. Wilma's laugh, decades old, had become a tool of mass conditioning, invisible but absolute. Meanwhile, underground circles celebrated. They claimed proof of what they had always believed, that Wilma's voice was a key to shaping society, that it did not require direct contact to manipulate minds, that entire generations could be molded like clay by hidden frequencies embedded in ordinary life. Their journals and newsletters instructed followers to listen not with ears but with the body, acknowledging that the song had migrated from vinyl to the ether, embedding itself where it could not be traced. By this time, Wilma Fingerdoo was no longer a name in the news. She had become a ghost, a frequency, a shadow in the mind of anyone who heard, watched, or even lived in the world shaped by her forbidden laugh. And the world, unwittingly, danced to her rhythm. By the early 1980s, obsession over the original Wilma Fingerdoo record had reached a fever pitch among a small but fanatical circle of collectors. These were not casual music enthusiasts. They were hunters of forbidden knowledge, men and women who believed the scratched vinyl contained secrets no other medium could carry. The song itself had become legendary, whispered about in record shops, hidden in backroom drawers, traded through coded letters, and passed hand to hand under the veil of secrecy. Possession of the original pressing was considered not merely rare, but sacred. Stories of disappearances began to circulate. Collectors vanished after bidding wars over a single disc. Some were found months later, incoherent and babbling in the alleys of Chicago or New York, still humming fragments of the laugh, eyes glazed as if the record had imprinted directly onto their neural pathways. Others were never found, leaving only rumors that they had been taken by the song itself, drawn into some invisible current, claimed by the frequency that had haunted decades. Murders, too, were linked to the vinyl. Two prominent collectors in Los Angeles were discovered dead in the same night, one strangled, the other drowned in a bathtub filled with melted wax from records. Authorities dismissed the connection at the time, attributing it to coincidence, but underground circles told a different story. The records demanded loyalty, and when betrayal occurred, the laugh retaliated. Possession came with a price, and obsession became a form of damnation. The cults that had long venerated Wilma Fingerdoo's song grew more structured. Manuals and handwritten texts circulated, offering instructions on listening rituals, safe handling of the record, and techniques for inducing the trance without losing oneself entirely. Some of these guides were coded with symbols borrowed from occult trad. Haitians, claiming that Wilma's frequency resonated not just with the human mind, but with the very architecture of reality. To follow the instructions was to risk madness, but the rewards, insight, power, transcendence, were said to be irresistible. Meanwhile, mainstream culture remained oblivious. New hits borrowed subtly from the rhythms of the original track. Television shows embedded fragments in background music, and the laugh, now a ghostly presence, continued to influence millions without ever being consciously noticed. The war over the record was silent, invisible, yet more potent than any conventional battle. Whoever controlled the original disc wielded power over minds, over perception, over reality itself. And in every city, in every hidden apartment or warehouse, there were those who would do anything, kill, vanish, worship, for the chance to touch that forbidden frequency once again. By the mid-1980s, the struggle over Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden record had escalated into a shadow war. On one side were the clandestine cults, hardened by decades of ritual and secrecy, who viewed the record as holy scripture, a map to unseen powers. On the other side were government agencies, FBI, CIA, and secret divisions of the military, who had long since recognized that the song was not mere entertainment, but a tool of influence capable of bending wills, shaping thoughts, and controlling crowds. And in the middle, a black market of collectors, thieves and sound engineers traded in fragments, bootlegs, and rumors, each hoping to claim a fragment of Wilma's power for themselves. Incidents became more frequent and more sinister. A government informant in New York described attending a private listening session in a dilapidated studio where cultists had amplified the laugh to ear-splitting levels. Participants writhed on the floor, moaning, laughing, crying, until several collapsed, unconscious. Security footage later vanished, and the event was erased from any official record. Meanwhile, agents reported that individuals exposed to stolen segments of the song began behaving unpredictably, refusing orders, committing thefts, even violent acts, seemingly compelled by an invisible influence that transcended ordinary psychological control. The black market network was ruthless. Collectors hired assassins to steal discs from rival collectors. Bootleggers created flawed copies, hoping to replicate the laugh's subtle power, only to find their buyers descending into madness, leaving behind shattered apartments, smeared records, and incoherent ramblings about hearing her in the walls. Rumors circulated of a collector in Chicago who disappeared after attempting to merge two bootlegs into a single, amplified recording. A year later, his apartment was found empty, save for the sea, a faint echo of laughter in the floorboards. Government involvement added another layer of danger. Certain programs reportedly experimented with broadcasting fragments of the song to unwitting populations, embedding Wilma's laugh within political speeches, television programs, and public ceremonies. Analysts later discovered that entire communities had reacted in unison to these subtle cues, some reporting mass euphoria, others panic, as if the song's influence had seeped into their nervous systems without warning. The three forces, cults, agencies, and the black market, began to collide, often violently, in the shadows of abandoned theaters, shipping docks, and deserted countryside estates. Each confrontation left its mark. Missing persons, unexplained deaths, and echoes of laughter that haunted neighborhoods for days. The forbidden song had become more than a relic. It had become a battlefield, invisible yet omnipresent, where power, obsession, and madness intersected. By the 1990s, Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song had evolved into something far more insidious. A hidden undercurrent beneath the surface of mass media. Television, radio, and emerging digital platforms carried fragments of her laugh, reversed, looped, and subtly layered into background tracks. The public remained blissfully unaware, laughing, humming, and tapping along to rhythms they could not consciously trace. Yet the effect was undeniable. Behavior shifted, moods synchronized, and millions responded in eerie unison to invisible cues embedded in programming. Marketing executives unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, incorporated the laugh's cadence into commercials, pop songs, and jingles. Crowds at concerts, sports events, and rallies reacted in ways no one could explain. Spontaneous bursts of laughter, synchronized clapping, sudden collective shivers. Sociologists noted a rise in mass suggestibility, fleeting hysteria, and episodes of contagious mirth among large groups, attributing it to cultural trends. But beneath their academic observations, the truth was darker. Wilma's forbidden frequency had become a tool of subtle control, infiltrating daily life like a virus. In private, cults documented this spread with awe and reverence. Journals from the era describe members tracking broadcasts and recordings, noting which channels, shows, and albums carried the hidden laugh. "She moves unseen," one entry read, "through wires, through waves, and into every ear that listens. The world dances and no one notices." For the devoted, Wilma had transcended mortality. Her voice was no longer just a song, it was an invisible hand, a presence capable of bending society without touching it. Meanwhile, government programs, some still classified, monitored these effects. Analysts reported patterns of mass emotional swings, inexplicable enthusiasm, and unplanned collective actions tied to specific media events. Leaked documents hinted at experiments designed to amplify the laugh through late-night broadcasts, public service announcements, and radio interference. Individuals exposed, even inadvertently, displayed heightened suggestibility, obedience, and emotional volatility, yet no one outside these secret circles fully understood why. By now, the song's influence had become a shadow infrastructure beneath daily life. It no longer mattered who heard the original Wilma Fingerdoo record. The frequency itself had diffused into culture, rituals, and technology. The laugh had left the record behind. It was everywhere and nowhere, guiding, controlling, and reshaping society, one imperceptible beat at a time. By the late 1990s, the hidden influence of Wilma Fingerdoo's song had begun to manifest in ways that were impossible to ignore. Across cities and towns, unexplained mass behaviors cropped up with alarming regularity. Entire crowds erupting into laughter at inappropriate moments, sudden panics during televised events, inexplicable emotional swings in classrooms and workplaces. Investigative journalists noted patterns that defied logic. Incidents clustered around certain broadcast times, certain music playlists, even in public spaces where the song itself had never played. Yet traces of its frequency, buried in background tracks, subliminally encoded, were present. One particularly chilling event occurred during a charity telethon in Chicago. Thousands of viewers reportedly began laughing uncontrollably, some collapsing in the aisles, while the live broadcast showed nothing overtly funny. In the aftermath, psychologists and law enforcement officials were baffled. Surveillance footage revealed subtle manipulations in audio frequencies, hidden in crowd noise, background music, even the tonal quality of the host's voice. The culprit, they would later learn, was the same forbidden laugh that had haunted decades. Wilma Fingerdoo's frequency had woven itself invisibly into the broadcast, compelling obedience, hysteria, and mirth all at once. At the same time, cult journals chronicled the phenomenon with a mix of triumph and fear. Members noted how her voice moves through screens and speakers, unseen, guiding the world to respond as she wills. They warned of the dangers. Exposure need not be intentional, and those who fell under its spell often lost control entirely, their behavior bending to the rhythm of the hidden laugh without conscious awareness. Some devoted themselves entirely, seeking to align their actions with the invisible song, believing it was a key to power, incite, or transcendence. Government agencies reportedly took note as well. Internal memos leaked decades later described concerns over mass emotional contagion and subliminal synchronization linked to public media. Analysts suspected that the laugh could be weaponized at scale, influencing populations, swaying crowds, and amplifying chaos, all without detection. Experiments in controlled environments confirmed the song's effects. Test groups exposed to subtle versions of the frequency exhibited heightened suggestibility, emotional volatility, and almost trance-like obedience. By now, the forbidden song had become an invisible puppeteer, orchestrating behaviors, emotions, and perceptions across entire populations. The world, unknowingly, danced to her rhythm, while those who knew the truth, cults, rogue operatives, and a few desperate investigators, recognized the terrifying reality. Wilma Fingerdoo's laugh had escaped its record, and nothing would ever stop it. By the dawn of the 2000s, Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song had entered the digital realm, an evolution that made its reach nearly unstoppable. Encoded fragments of the laugh appeared in MP3s, online videos, and streaming playlists, often so subtle that even the most attentive listener could not consciously detect them. Yet the effects were immediate and profound. People reported inexplicable urges to laugh, to mimic, to act in synchrony with rhythms they never consciously heard. What was once a vinyl-bound contagion had transformed into a viral, digital phenomenon, invisible yet omnipresent. Underground forums and early social networks became conduits for this hidden influence. Members shared recordings, altered audio files, and clips of performances, claiming they were merely historical curiosities. In reality, every upload carried fragments of the frequency, amplifying the laugh's reach exponentially. Digital media allowed the song to cross oceans, bypassing borders and infecting millions who had no awareness of its origins. Entire communities reported mass behavioral anomalies, synchronized laughter, irrational fear, compulsive movements, and episodes of euphoric mania, all linked to media containing traces of Wilma's forbidden laugh. Meanwhile, cults adapted to the digital age with alarming precision. They instructed followers to manipulate file-sharing networks, embed hidden frequencies in music, and craft videos that activated the mind without ever revealing the source. Manuals emphasized that the song no longer needed a physical record to exert control. The medium had shifted. To listen was to obey, to be affected was inevitable, and to resist was almost impossible. By now, Wilma's voice was everywhere, yet nowhere tangible, a ghost encoded in the very fabric of digital sound. Government agencies grew increasingly concerned. Internal reports, declassified, decades later, described experiments where small towns and corporate offices were exposed to subtly altered media files. Employees, residents, and students displayed heightened suggestibility, synchronized responses, and unusual compliance with instructions, often without recognizing the cause. Analysts concluded that the forbidden song, once confined to cults and collectors, had become a tool of mass influence, capable of shaping society at scale. By the mid-2000s, it was clear. Wilma Fingerdoo's laugh had outgrown vinyl, airwaves, and analog media. It had become a digital predator, slipping silently through networks, reshaping moods, behaviors, and perceptions. And the world, oblivious, continued to dance to her rhythm. By the late 2000s, the power of Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song had begun manifesting in incidents that could no longer be ignored as coincidence. In multiple cities, entire audiences at concerts, sporting events, and public gatherings erupted into sudden synchronized laughter or panic, leaving witnesses bewildered. In one chilling case, a large-scale charity event in Los Angeles saw hundreds of attendees collapse in unison, some convulsing, while emergency responders struggled to explain the mass hysteria. Video footage later revealed subtle audio anomalies, fragments of a laugh interwoven beneath the music and announcements, imperceptible to the conscious ear, yet devastatingly effective. Online, the influence accelerated. Viral videos, music files, and social media clips embedded with traces of Wilma's frequency spread like wildfire. Millions unknowingly participated in a synchronized, invisible choreography dictated by the laugh. Behavioral scientists noted spikes in collective mimicry, emotional contagion, and mass suggestibility, often linked to content with no apparent thematic connection to the events. Ordinary citizens found themselves compelled to hum, repeat phrases, or act in ways that mirrored those around them, as though the laugh had become a conductor of human behavior. Cults and collectors, long aware of the song's true reach, exploited the new era with precision. They created playlists, curated media, and shared encoded files designed to maximize exposure and psychological impact. Manuals advised adherents to allow her voice to move through the ether, stressing that the digital medium had become a perfect vector. Followers documented cases where entire neighborhoods reported collective episodes of uncontrollable laughter, panic, or obsession. Proof that the song no longer required proximity or even intention to exert its influence. Government agencies, now fully aware of the potential for mass manipulation, quietly monitored the phenomenon. Internal memos describe experimental use of modified broadcasts and streaming content to test behavioral effects on populations. Analysts reported startling consistency. Those exposed to the hidden frequencies demonstrated heightened compliance, emotional alignment, and irrational behavior, while control groups remained unaffected. The implications were terrifying. Wilma Fingerdoo's song had become an instrument of control on a scale previously unimaginable. By this point, the forbidden song had transcended its origins, spreading through analog and digital channels alike. Entire communities, cities, and nations were now vulnerable, influenced by fragments of a laugh that no one alive had consciously authorized. The world had become a stage, and Wilma's invisible hand was conducting, orchestrating a chaos that was both subtle and unstoppable. By the 2010s, the forbidden influence of Wilma Fingerdoo's song had escalated into a global phenomenon, seeping into political, social, and economic systems with frightening precision. Rogue networks and cults no longer limited themselves to private experiments. They began embedding fragments of the laugh into propaganda, advertisements, viral campaigns, and political broadcasts. Entire voting districts, marketing campaigns, and public initiatives experienced inexplicable surges in conformity, enthusiasm, or agitation, all traced back to imperceptible traces of Wilma's frequency. Insiders whispered of meetings in windowless offices, where strategists listened to layered tracks of the song, calibrating them to target specific emotional responses. Employees, voters, and entire communities were subjected to these hidden manipulations without awareness. Analysts reported patterns in crowd behavior, mass compliance, irrational collective decisions, and emotional contagion that defied all conventional sociological explanation. The song had become a tool, weaponized by those who understood its mechanics and nearly invisible to the public. At the same time, cults grew bolder. Manuals from secretive circles emphasized the importance of digital diffusion, advising members to encode segments in everything from streaming playlists to political campaign ads. "She moves through every wave," one text warned, "through the air, through screens, and into minds unprepared. To harness her is to wield dominion over the invisible currents of human thought." Those who followed the instructions reported heightened awareness, a sense of power, and glimpses into what they described as the architecture of obedience. Government agencies were aware but hamstrung. Classified documents reveal that internal studies tracked the song's influence across states and countries. Experiments showed that exposure to carefully calibrated fragments produced predictable behavioral effects, emotional alignment, increased suggestibility, even shifts in decision-making that could tilt elections, stock markets, and public opinion. The forbidden laugh had evolved beyond entertainment, ritual, or obsession. It had become a mechanism for global control. By now, the world was saturated with Wilma Fingerdoo's invisible presence. Her laugh, encoded in every conceivable medium, had become both weapon and religion, a force capable of bending individuals, crowds, and entire systems to its will. And yet, the majority remained blind, humming along, dancing unknowingly to rhythms they were never meant to hear. By the mid-2010s, Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden laugh had achieved a level of subtle omnipresence that defied comprehension. Digital platforms, social media feeds, and streaming services had become conduits for the hidden frequency, allowing it to infiltrate millions of unsuspecting minds daily. Tiny fragments of her voice, imperceptible to conscious hearing, triggered patterns of behavior, sudden bursts of hysteria, compulsive imitation, inexplicable emotional swings. Entire communities reported mass laughter, sudden agitation, or eerie synchrony in thought and action, all seemingly spontaneous, yet orchestrated by the invisible song. Hackers and rogue networks exploited this evolution. By embedding loops of Wilma's laugh into trending videos, advertisements, and popular music tracks, they amplified her reach exponentially. A viral clip could influence millions in hours, triggering subconscious alignment, emotional contagion, and even irrational decision-making. Analysts studying social behavior noted unprecedented spikes in synchronized actions, mass movements, online mobs, or collective panic with no discernible origin. Each incident left society questioning its own free will, unaware of the true puppet master behind these subtle manipulations. Cults documented every case meticulously. Journals from clandestine followers described waves of obedience spreading across the globe, each wave tracing the digital trails of the laugh. Members noted that exposure need not be deliberate. Mere proximity to a phone, speaker, or screen carrying the frequency was sufficient. "She moves unseen," one entry warned, "through wires, through the ether, through the very devices that claim to serve us." For devotees, this digital omnipresence confirmed that Wilma had transcended mortality, her song now a force beyond the physical. Government programs, once confined to testing in old environments, faced an uncontainable problem. Reports show that even the most secure networks, encrypted communications and surveillance systems could not prevent the song's infiltration. Analysts admitted that its effects on decision-making, emotional stability, and public behavior were real, measurable, and terrifyingly precise. Entire societies were unknowingly dancing to a rhythm they could not hear, guided by a centuries-old recording of a forbidden voice. By this point, the forbidden song had become more than cultural artifact, ritual, or curiosity. It was a digital predator, invisible yet omnipresent, manipulating thoughts, emotions, and actions on a scale that no one could fully comprehend. The world continued to move forward, unaware that its choices, its laughter, and its fear were all being guided by Wilma Fingerdoo's undying influence. By the late 2010s, the forbidden influence of Wilma Fingerdoo's song had entered a new, even more dangerous frontier: artificial intelligence and algorithmic amplification. Streaming platforms, social media algorithms, and content recommendation engines became unintentional, or perhaps deliberate, vectors for the hidden laugh. AI systems, trained to maximize engagement, began propagating clips and audio fragments that carried the imperceptible frequency, amplifying the song's reach beyond anything Wilma could have imagined in the 1940s. Millions now consumed it unknowingly, their moods, decisions, and behaviors subtly altered by patterns embedded in code. Deepfake technologies further compounded the effect. Videos of public figures, actors, and influencers were subtly layered with fragments of the laugh, invisible to the naked eye and ear, yet capable of triggering mass emotional responses. Entire audiences found themselves drawn to certain content, compelled to mimic, laugh, or react without awareness of why. Analysts tracking these trends noted the alarming consistency. Human behavior became increasingly synchronized, emotions easily manipulated, and even social media discourse shifted along invisible currents of influence. Cults and covert networks studied these developments with fascination and fear. "The song has become a ghost in the machine," one journal entry noted. "Alive in code, alive in algorithm, alive in every device. She now moves through minds faster than sound, faster than sight, bending reality without leaving a trace." Members experimented with creating micro-targeted exposures, influencing everything from online debates to stock market sentiment, measuring results with precision that rivaled any known psychological experiment. Government analysts, alarmed yet constrained, documented the effects in classified reports. Populations exposed to AI cura, TED content embedded with the laugh displayed measurable shifts in conformity, obedience, and emotional volatility. Social experiments, often disguised as marketing studies or civic polls, confirmed that even subtle exposure could reshape collective behavior, influence voting patterns, or trigger spontaneous mass hysteria. Wilma's forbidden song had become a tool of psychological warfare, silent, invisible, and nearly impossible to counteract. By now, the laugh had transcended media, memory, and time. It had merged with technology, algorithms, and human perception, a force guiding thoughts and emotions without consent. The world was unknowingly dancing to her rhythm, and the true scale of her influence remained hidden, except to the few who dared to trace the ghostly echoes of Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song. By the early 2020s, a small number of individuals had begun to recognize the insidious presence of Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song. These were not casual listeners or conspiracy theorists. They were people with acute awareness, trained in psychology, sound engineering, or behavioral science. They noticed subtle shifts in their own moods, compulsions to laugh or mimic behavior, and moments of inexplicable compliance with social trends. Some described it as a ghost in the mind, a presence that whispered, nudged, and shaped perception without consent. Those who attempted resistance discovered the song's influence was not merely passive. Exposure, even brief or indirect, could trigger intense headaches, disorientation, and emotional instability. Several documented cases of people isolating themselves from all digital media, attempting analog living, only to find that fragments of the laugh persisted in ambient sounds, old recordings, and even memories of repeated exposure. The psychological toll was immense. Insomnia, paranoia, and a creeping sense of surveillance, like being watched by the echo of a voice that could see into the mind. Cults, now fully aware of these resistors, treated them as anomalies, often recording their behaviors with a mixture of fear and fascination. Manuals described methods to either reintegrate these individuals into the fold or neutralize their awareness. Some minds resist, but resistance itself confirms her power, one journal warned. The more they fight, the more they reveal the depth of control she wields. Awareness is dangerous. Knowledge is dangerous. Resistance is dangerous. Many who resisted quietly vanished from public view, retreating into isolated environments, yet traces of their stories appeared in online forums, cryptic journals, and leaked government documents. Government and private analysts, quietly studying these individuals, confirmed a disturbing reality. Wilma's song could adapt. The more a person tried to avoid it, the more the frequency found alternate channels, encoded in ambient noise, hidden in innocuous media, or replicated in subconscious memory patterns. Resistance was possible, but at immense cost, and never guaranteed to succeed. Only those with extraordinary mental discipline, environmental control, and relentless awareness could hope to evade the song's subtle grasp. By now it was clear. The forbidden laugh was no longer a song, a relic, or a curiosity. It had become a sentient force, adaptive and relentless, capable of infiltrating minds, shaping decisions, and bending reality subtly but irreversibly. The few who understood this lived in constant vigilance, aware that every sound, every media file, every laugh in a crowd could be an extension of her invisible influence. By the mid-2020s, Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song had begun to intersect with events on a global scale. Social unrest, mass protests, inexplicable panic waves, and sudden surges of collective behavior were increasingly linked to media carrying fragments of her laugh. Analysts noted that during crises, political upheavals, economic uncertainty, or cultural flashpoints, the frequency seemed to amplify, almost as if feeding on chaos. Entire populations, entirely unaware, were subtly guided. Crowds moved in synchrony, emotions escalated unpredictably, and decisions that defied logic were made almost uniformly. International organizations and intelligence agencies quietly documented these phenomena. Internal reports described how viral clips, advertisements, and even mundane news broadcasts embedded with minute segments of Wilma's laugh could trigger sudden spikes in conformity, obedience, or hysteria. In some regions, these effects coincided with political events, unexplainable voter behavior, mass compliance with directives, and emotional contagion that defied standard sociological models. The laugh had become a global actor, a force invisible yet capable of orchestrating collective behavior with terrifying precision. Cults and rogue networks began exploiting these dynamics. Using sophisticated tracking tools, they identified hotspots of unrest and strategically distributed encoded content. She thrives in the chaos, a manual instructed, and moves through it, unseen, unheard, yet felt in every impulse. Influence is strongest when the world burns, and her reach is limitless. Followers recorded instances of entire communities swaying to rhythms they could not perceive, confirming that the song now transcended not just geography, but consciousness itself. Even governments struggled to respond. Attempts to regulate or suppress the spread of encoded media proved futile, as the song's fragments were replicated, masked, and redistributed faster than any authority could intervene. Analysts conceded that traditional containment strategies were meaningless. The forbidden song had evolved beyond the physical, beyond media, and beyond detection by conventional means. It existed now as a viral consciousness, flowing through networks, minds, and collective perception. By this point, the world had unknowingly become a stage for Wilma Fingerdoo's song. Her laugh, once confined to forbidden recordings, was now an invisible architect of human behavior, shaping societies, amplifying chaos, and bending reality to patterns only she, or the few who understood her legacy, could discern. The invisible hand was everywhere, and the global consequences of ignoring it were only beginning to unfold. By now, the toll on those who confronted Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song directly had become undeniable. Psychologists, sound engineers, journalists, and researchers who attempted to study its effects reported extreme mental strain, insomnia, anxiety, hallucinations, and a persistent sense of being observed. Some described hearing the laugh in moments of silence, echoing in corners of the mind, impossible to ignore. Others experienced involuntary mimicry, sudden emotional swings, and compulsions to act in ways they knew were irrational, proof that the song's influence was both cognitive and physical. Several researchers documented cases where prolonged exposure led to irreversible psychological changes. Individuals became hyper-aware of subtle auditory patterns, developing obsessive listening habits. Yet every attempt to escape or silence the frequency seemed only to deepen its grip. One recorded account described a man who, after isolating himself in a remote cabin for months, began to trace the song in birdsong, wind, and distant machinery, convinced it was embedded in every natural and man-made sound. By the time he was found, his mind had fragmented, leaving a warning scrawled in journals. "It's everywhere. She is everywhere." Cults and clandestine networks tracked these confrontations closely. "Those who look directly at her laugh are broken," a handbook warned. "But in their ruin lies knowledge. The risk is permanent, but the insight gained is absolute. Never underestimate the cost of seeing what others cannot." Followers reported that some of the most insightful accounts came from those who survived the experience, their writings a mix of revelation, terror, and obsessive precision. These records became tools for understanding, but also cautionary tales about the dangers of engaging too directly with Wilma's influence. Government studies, hidden from the public eye, confirmed the physical manifestation of the song's power. Elevated stress responses, heightened cortisol levels, neurological activity linked to compulsion and mimicry. These were not anomalies. They were measurable, reproducible, and terrifying in their precision. The forbidden laugh had evolved into a force that could literally alter human biology, bending emotions, thoughts, and actions to its subtle but unyielding rhythm. By this stage, it was clear. Those who confronted the song directly risked permanent psychological and physiological transformation. Wilma Fingerdoo's laugh had become a predator, invisible, intangible, and yet capable of reshaping the mind itself. Few could study it safely, and fewer still could resist its pull without consequence. The price of knowledge was steep, and the deeper one ventured, the heavier the cost became. Even for those who had never consciously heard the full recording of Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song, its influence permeated daily life. Ordinary individuals, unaware of the hidden frequencies embedded in music, media, and ambient sounds, were subtly guided in ways impossible to detect. Consumer habits, emotional responses, political leanings, and social interactions all bore the invisible imprint of her laugh. Entire neighborhoods and communities exhibited patterns of conformity, aggression, or compulsion without explanation, an invisible choreography orchestrated by a force no one realized was present. Researchers tracing these effects described them as subconscious alignments. People would laugh at jokes that made no sense, vote for policies they barely understood, or move in groups with uncanny synchrony. Even moments of solitude were affected. Fragments of the song, imperceptible yet potent, found their way into dreams, reveries, and internal dialogues. Ordinary conversations, music playlists, and background noise became conduits for subtle persuasion, creating a society whose collective behavior was continuously nudged without consent. Cults documented these manifestations as proof of Wilma's omnipresence. Their handbooks detailed methods of detecting the laugh in ordinary life, warning that no environment was safe. "She inhabits the spaces you ignore," one manual read. "Every sound, every vibration, every laugh carries a trace. Awareness alone is insufficient. To resist, one must learn to filter reality itself." Followers often attempted to isolate themselves, but even nature, city noise, and radio waves carried fragments of her influence, demonstrating that Wilma Fingerdoo's song was no longer confined to media. It had become a force woven into the fabric of everyday life. Government and private analysts quietly acknowledged a terrifying truth. Entire IETs were unknowingly under the sway of an invisible agent. Behavior, emotion, and social dynamics were all being shaped by a force undetectable to the conscious mind. Attempts to measure or mitigate its influence revealed only that the song's reach was adaptive, persistent, and resistant to conventional methods of containment. Wilma's laugh had become an unseen architect, guiding humanity with subtle precision. By now, the forbidden song was fully integrated into reality itself. Ordinary people, oblivious to its presence, continued to make choices, build relationships, and respond to stimuli under its shadow. The invisible force shaped culture, society, and individual lives alike, leaving behind a world whose behavior and thought were no longer entirely their own. Wilma Fingerdoo's influence had moved beyond record, medium, or listener. It had become a hidden current running through civilization itself. The ultimate reach of Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song was now impossible to overstate. From private homes to global media streams, from isolated rural communities to the busiest urban centers, the invisible frequency flowed like an undercurrent through every layer of society. Governments, corporations, and ordinary citizens alike moved along invisible lines drawn by her laugh. Decisions, both monumental and trivial, were subtly guided, and entire populations unknowingly conformed to a rhythm that had existed long before digital networks and mass media even existed. Historians tracing this influence noted patterns of repetition across decades: sudden cultural shifts, inexplicable fads, mass hysteria, and surges of collective emotion. Each event, seemingly spontaneous, could be traced back to fragments of her laugh embedded in some form, whether a radio recording, an early vinyl pressing, or the faint echoes captured in archived media. Wilma Fingerdoo's song had transcended time, technology, and memory. It had become a ghost that could bend society itself, a force operating beneath the surface of what humans believed to be free will. Those few who attempted to expose the truth faced near constant peril. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and independent researchers reported harassment, professional ruin, and even psychological collapse. In private journals, they confessed that even their attempts to warn others were being subtly undermined. Social media feeds, news articles, and audio recordings were infused with fragments of the laugh, redirecting attention, dulling critical thought, and fostering doubt. Every resistance, no matter how deliberate, fed into the song's growing mastery. Cults, rogue networks, and underground societies documented the unfolding consequences with a mix of reverence and fear. One clandestine journal warned, "The laugh is no longer an object of curiosity. It is now a river, carving the landscape of thought itself. To fight it is to fight reality. To ignore it is to submit to it." Ordinary people, entirely unaware, continued to live lives subtly choreographed by a force invisible, pervasive, and relentless. Humanity's collective behavior, emotion, and thought were no longer entirely their own, and the cost of remaining unaware was mounting every day. By the end of this descent, it became clear. The forbidden song was not merely a relic of the past, a scandal of the 1940s, or a curiosity of culture. Wilma Fingerdoo's laugh had become a living, adaptive force, a sentient rhythm woven into the fabric of human experience, shaping the world without consent, choice, or awareness. The consequences of ignorance were now irreversible, and only those who dared to see could hope to understand the full scope of her power. The final truth was unavoidable. Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden song had left an indelible mark on humanity, one that could never be erased. From the moment her laugh first slipped into the grooves of a record in the 1940s to its modern-day resurrection through algorithms, AI, and viral media, it had evolved into something far beyond comprehension. It was no longer a song, a laugh, or even a memory. It was a force that had merged with human perception, shaping thought, emotion, and action on a scale both microscopic and global. Those who had glimpsed its power firsthand understood the terrifying scope. Resistance was possible, but only at extraordinary personal cost. Lives had been fractured, minds distorted, and realities reshaped by a force that thrived on attention, awareness, and memory. Entire societies had been molded, subtly and invisibly, to move along paths dictated by fragments of a laugh that was simultaneously ancient and perpetually alive. Wilma Fingerdoo had become a silent architect of civilization, her forbidden song the blueprint for an invisible empire of influence. Even now, the vast majority remained unaware. People laughed, loved, argued, and obeyed in ways they could not explain, their decisions quietly guided by rhythms they could not perceive. History, culture, and personal destiny were all subtly entwined with her legacy, a force that had outlasted media, governments, and generations. The invisible power of the song was complete, omnipresent, adaptive, and unyielding. Its echoes ran through human consciousness like a hidden current, impossible to track, impossible to stop, and impossible to fully understand. And yet, in the shadows, a few remained. Watchers, thinkers, and resistors, those who understood that Wilma Fingerdoo's laugh was more than entertainment, more than scandal, more than curiosity. It was a weapon, a guide, a force of nature cap, able of bending reality itself. They documented, they warned, they attempted to preserve sanity, but the world around them moved on, oblivious to the invisible hand shaping every choice. This is the legacy of the forbidden song, a whisper that became a river, a laugh that became a force, a record that became a ruler of minds. Humanity continues, unaware, dancing to rhythms it cannot hear, shaping a future subtly guided by a presence it will never see. Wilma Fingerdoo's forbidden laugh remains, eternal and unstoppable, a haunting testament to the truth that some forces, once unleashed, can never be contained, and some secrets, once heard, can never be forgotten.